So we'll start by talking about the types of scientific evidence that's being used in criminal cases. There's two types primarily that I want to talk to you about today. The first is the genetic information, and the second is the neuroscientific information. The genetic information that's being used is a particular person has a genetic predisposition for a behavior. So for example, a criminal defendant may claim the reason that I acted the way I did, the reason that I killed the person that I did, is because I have a particular genetic abnormality, and that genetic abnormality makes me more violent than other people, or more likely to act impulsively than other people. There's many different gene variants that have been studied that suggest there's some link between genetic types and behavioral types. So for example, one that's increasingly being debated about and published about is a gene called monoamine oxidase A, or MAOA. And there was a study that was conducted in New Zealand which looked at early childhood violence, so the likelihood that a person had suffered things like childhood abuse, and evaluated whether or not they had particular variants of the gene. They call them the short variant of the gene, or the short-long variant of the gene. And what they found is that when certain environmental stressors were present and there was a particular genetic abnormality, that people, these boys that they were studying, had an increased risk of being violent. It should be emphasized that it's simply an increased risk of being violent. It isn't a one-to-one ratio. So many people who have the gene variant aren't violent as adults. And people who have the gene variant but don't have the environmental stressors, that is, they didn't suffer childhood abuse, those people also don't exhibit the increased effect of violence. So it's important to understand that all genetic variants require a gene and environmental interaction, and all they do is increase your likelihood of being at risk of a particular type of condition. They don't determine it. There's no such thing as a one-to-one relationship between gene and behavior. So that's type 1 of evidence that we'll talk about, how they're being used in criminal cases. Type 2 is the neuroscientific evidence. So increasingly, criminal defendants are capitalizing on emerging neuroscience. And emerging neuroscience looks into the correlation between different variations in brains and behavior. So for example, one well-characterized region of the brain is the frontal lobe region of the brain. And by example, adolescents continue to develop the frontal lobe region of the brain until maybe they're around 25 years of age. And the frontal lobe region of the brain is important for things like judgment, your ability to make rational choices, to premeditate your decisions. And so we see that children, for example, are more impulsive and less likely to make good choices when presented with novel situations. This may be in part because of the developing frontal lobe region of the brain. Likewise, if you suffer some major brain trauma, you're in a car accident, or you have some sort of disease that causes a lesion in one area of your brain, or damage in one part of your brain, that may also cause you to be predisposed to act in different ways. But just like the genetic information, the neurological information is not one-to-one. So that you have a developmental delay in the frontal lobe region of your brain, or that you have brain damage in one particular region of your brain, doesn't mean that you will act in a particular way, only that you're at an increased risk of acting in a particular way. We still have to look at your environment and potentially the choices that you're making in the outcomes of your behavior. So now we can look at how this is being influenced and used in criminal cases. We'll start with the US side of things. So going back for at least 20 years now, genetic information has been introduced into criminal cases. Criminal defendants will claim, for example, that the reason that they acted the way they did, they would like to attribute to their genes. They'll say something like, the reason I was violent was because I'm a male. All of the males in my family exhibit an increased propensity for violence. This is a characteristic or a genetic trait that is passed from one generation to the next. And their claim is either that they should not be held responsible for their crimes, or that they should be held less responsible. So either we should find them guilty of a lesser offense, or once we've found them guilty, we should decrease the extent to which they're punished because it's outside of their control. We'd like to say in the US, it's not my bad character, it's my bad genes. Same kinds of claims are being made with neuroscience. So a criminal defendant will come into a criminal case. They'll point to either brain scans or neuropsychological testing to say the reason that I did the thing that I did, the reason I acted the way that I did, is not because of bad choices that I made, it's because of the bad brain that I have. One of the things that's been interesting for us to learn is when people make claims about genetic or neurological abnormalities, what kind of evidence are they using to support their claims in criminal cases? And in the US and in this project where we were looking at all of the cases where this evidence has been introduced from 2004 to 2009, one aspect that we wanted to look at was, were they introducing specific testing or were they making more general claims? So general claim, for example, of a genetic abnormality would be to say all of the males in my family for many generations have acted this way, therefore it must be genetic. A different approach would be to have specific testing done. So to have actual DNA extracted, to have it analyzed by a geneticist, and to look for specific genetic abnormalities. And we see in very few, but in several cases in the United States, this type of specific gene characterization is happening. And it's happening in particular with two genes, with monoamine oxidase A, MAOA, and with the serotonin transporter, the serotonin promoter region. And that's because there have been several peer-reviewed studies that have characterized the linkage between serotonin levels and impulsivity and depression, as well as with monoamine oxidase A and impulsivity and depression, as well as violence. Those studies show that there's no direct link between having a genetic type and having a behavior. But it does suggest that there is an increased risk of acting in a particular manner if you have the genetic abnormality and specific environmental stressors. So this is a difficult problem for courts because the evidence that we're introducing doesn't suggest a one-to-one relationship. Instead, it's simply one of many factors which may influence behavior. Likewise, we have evidence that shows, purely apart from genetics, purely apart from neuroscience, that if you have certain types of environmental stressors like childhood abuse or poor upbringing or poor education, these things are likewise likely to increase your capacity to be violent. Nevertheless, it seems that the scientific information has a greater impact on decision making for judges and for juries than does evidence that likewise has an impact on your behavior, like a poor socioeconomic background. It seems that there's something about the scientific information, whether it's simply science, which is appealing to people and they can grasp and understand, or the magic of science that seems to be more persuasive and more compelling, even if the evidence is better, that shows a link between poor backgrounds and outcomes. Now, we suspect that part of the reason this is true is because you're able to localize it much more specifically. If you can sequence somebody's genes, the jury can say, that person is different than me and different from every other person that I know who has a poor upbringing because they have a specific genetic abnormality. Now, of course, if we sequenced everybody's genome in the US and in the world, we may find that not to be true, but nevertheless, right now, it seems it's more powerful. So the question is, should we be making decisions based on this evidence? My own view is that the evidence is neither favorable or disfavorable for a criminal defendant, that the evidence is neutral in effect. All we've done is we've been able to describe better why a person did the thing that they did. But it doesn't answer whether they did that thing. And in the US at least, the way that we evaluate criminal defendants is by their actions, not by their genetic constitution or by their neurological constitution. So as to whether or not we should be holding people responsible, my own view is that this evidence simply tells us the causes rather than excusing what they did.